We reached out to our audience and asked them how they feel about the state of politics, and the responses were pretty grim. 89% said they didn't feel inspired by politics, and 93% felt they didn't feel represented. Why do you think so many people feel like they don't necessarily belong to Australian politics?
I feel like that is a pretty accurate approach to have to what is happening in this place at the moment. I think part of the big part of the reason is that we're facing these massive crises. We've got a climate crisis, we've got a rental crisis and a housing crisis, and politicians aren't fixing it. And so people look at what is happening in Canberra and see the confected arguments that go on that aren't actually about the real problems that we're facing. And so people think, well, why should I bother paying attention at all? And I've always been someone who's felt that politics is a place where you can actually tackle some of those big issues. Government can step in and make housing affordable or stop opening coal and gas. But I understand why people are looking at what goes on and saying, well, you're not addressing the things that matter to me, the cost of living crisis that I'm going through, the rental crisis, the climate crisis. Why should I bother with you? I think it's perfectly understandable.
And even the responses that we got echo what a lot of our generation feel, which is issues with the climate crisis, you said, HECS, cost of living, rental crisis, housing crisis, kind of just every crisis you can imagine is being thrown at us. And it feels like a lot of the time we disengage from it. But how do you think that we can get more young people invested in politics?
I think the main thing that politicians try to do to maintain the status quo is to crush hope, right? Is to make people feel like there's no hope that it could be any different, that this is just the way it is, and you just got to accept that we're going to give, over $100 billion in handouts to wealthy property investors, and you just have to cop unlimited rent rises, and that you can't change the system, and that nothing can be done can change it. What we've seen over the years, though, is that actually that's not right. Like, if you push and push and push hard enough, things can change, and things can change really, really quickly. And so we can't promise people things are going to happen overnight, by voting green or joining a protest or whatever. But I can say from being inside this place that when people push and push and push, what happens is the politicians say no, 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 yes. And then everything's impossible until it's not. And you look at marriage equality, for example. You had Labor and Liberal both voting for marriage discrimination, and we pushed and we pushed and we pushed, and we got marriage equality, and now people couldn't imagine life without it, right? And I think there's lots of examples of that where people have fought and fought and fought, and then we've got the change that makes society better.
Even within responses, 83% said they don't feel confident in the Labor government, and they felt very trapped between the choices between Albanese and Dutton, basically saying that Albanese is disappointing them and Dutton terrifies them. In fact, one responder said that Albanese was a wolf in sheep's clothing and Dutton is just a wolf. And I walked with you and Senator Shoebridge recently in the Canberra, and I kind of got the sentiment from members of the public that they also felt quite betrayed from the Labor government. Why do you think people especially feel betrayed by Labor?
Well, people are telling us it's getting harder every day to tell Labor and Liberal apart. Right, we've got Labor here trying to out-Dutton by beating up on migrants, introducing legislation that's introduces Trump-style travel bans that says we're going to just blacklist whole countries from ever being able to come into Australia. You've got Labor backing handouts to wealthy property investors that are denying renters the chance to buy their own home. You've got Labor saying they agree with the Liberals about opening up coal and gas, and Labor's new strategy says we're going to keep coal and gas past 2050, right? Meanwhile, we know Dutton has made his political career out of punching down and just finds groups to try to demonise for political gain. That's his strategy. But people voted at the last election because we wanted to get rid of Scott Morrison and the Liberals and hope that there would actually be change, and instead we're seeing much more of the same, right? And that's why there's such a high level of disappointment. People have got Dutton's number, people understand what he's like, but there was hope that this government might be different, but it's getting much, much more difficult to tell them apart. But one of the things that kind of gets masked by our voting system is that Labor's vote actually went backwards at the last election, right? And so did the coalitions. And you've now got less than a third of the country voting for the government. They might have won more than half of the seats, but less than a third of the country voted for them. about a third of the country voted for the coalition, about a third votes for someone else. And you've just seen in the Tasmanian election as well, like that same process repeating it, and you're seeing it around the world. People are saying it's getting harder to tell you apart, and we want something else. And I think at the next election, all the pundits are saying there's every chance it's going to be like no one will win a majority. We'll be back in that situation again. Like what people want will actually be reflected in the parliament. And I think it's a really exciting opportunity for people to be really powerful and put someone at the table who's going to fight for them. Because one of the things that we're seeing at the moment is that this government is not even pretending to fight for people who are doing it tough, not even pretending to fight for renters or fight the climate crisis anymore. And I think that's what people want from their representative, someone who's going to fight.
I think that our generation are going to prove to be a very large voting bloc, and especially so in the last federal election where there was that uptick in independence and votes towards the Greens. Do you think that the next election, I mean, I guess you were saying as well, but do you think that all the issues that we're facing and sort of, me and my friends constantly talk about, like it's all those crises we were saying, do you think that's going to really impact the Labor government? And do you think that there's a way out for them while they're currently in this trajectory?
It is going to impact. Like a third of the country rents, but up till this Parliament and this fight, they haven't had a political voice, and the Greens have been fighting for renters in Parliament, and we've been really clear that we want to be the party of renters, because up till now it's all been about people who've got 4 properties, how can we help them go and buy their 5th? Like that's been the policy of the government, and 75% of the Labor MPs in Parliament have investment properties, right? So they sit and they look at housing policy and they look at it through a very different lens to what everyone else looks at it. Similarly, they take donations from the coal and gas corporations, and we don't. And I think the government, Liberal and Labor, have actually failed to clock that society has changed and that there's now a whole group of people in society who, even if you do all the things that are asked of you, you go and study or you work hard, you then end up with massive debts. You can't forget about buying a house. You can't even rent a place near where you work or where you study or where your families are. It becomes impossible to see how you're going to get out of debt. Then cost of groceries keep going up, the cost of rent keeps going up, and it becomes ever more difficult to not only not get ahead, but just to even keep your head above water. And I don't think the politicians have clocked just how bad it is getting for people. They've got their own privilege that they want to protect. They've got their own donations that they want to protect at the moment, but that can't last, right? And we're now seeing a situation where, Tony Abbott, remember him, gets turfed out of office by someone who says, I want to stop opening up coal mines. And I think the public opinion is changing, and this is why I would say, I know people are right to be cynical of politics. People have really understandable despair, but the politicians trade on that, right? They want to crush hope, and we've got to show that there's actually a different way of doing things, that if we take on these big corporations, we can actually do things like freeze rent, we can stop the price gouging from the supermarkets, we can do things that get mental and dental health into Medicare, we can do all of these things that would actually mean a better life for people.
Speaking of sort of changing opinions, you and the Australian Greens are strongly opposed to Labor's future gas strategy. Can you talk a bit more why you are opposed to it?
We are in a climate crisis. There's people in northern New South Wales who still haven't been able to get back into their homes since the floods. There's people in Queensland who can't afford to insure their house now because of coal and gas-fuelled climate events like floods. And the world scientists have said over the weekend that, look, they are really worried that we're not going to make it, that we're not going to be able to stop runaway climate change, and that it's going to cook the planet during the lifetime of kids who are at primary school today. And they're saying we've got to act now. And in the face of all of that, Labor has approved 5 new coal projects, 8 new gas projects, and has just come out and said that their strategy is for coal and gas to run past 2050, right? They told us we were going to be at zero pollution by 2050. Now that's too late, but now I think that they think they're worried about winning or losing some seats in certain parts of the country, and they think they've got to go like full pedal to the metal on gas and coal. But again, I just think they're totally misreading people. You can't put the fire out while you're pouring petrol on it. And like the first step towards fixing a problem surely should be to stop making the problem worse. We got to stop opening coal and gas mines, and we like just utterly oppose Labor's gas strategy, which is to keep coal and gas out open past 2050. Like that's just not compatible with a safe climate.
What do you think of Labor's 43% emissions reduction target by 2030? Do you think it's good enough, or do we need to, like, what do we need to better reach emission targets?
So the first thing we need to do to tackle the climate crisis is stop opening coal and gas mines, right? We are not going to meet any climate targets if we keep opening coal and gas mines, but that's what Labor's doing. Like the discussion we should be having is, right, well, we've got coal and gas in the system, but we know it's harmful. How do we get out of it in a way that supports the workers and communities? And instead, they're making the problem worse. So the first step is stop opening coal and gas mines. Secondly, the question is how quickly do we get out of it? Yesterday is the answer to that, right? That's when we should have got out of it. Labor's target is actually based on the world heating by more than 2 degrees. When scientists have said 2 degrees is the absolute upper limit, Labor's target's not even consistent with that, right? So they need to go much quicker than what they're doing. I'm worried we're not even going to get there at the moment because they're just backing opening coal and gas mines hand over fist.
Switching gears, a lot of our respondents and even a lot of my friends who I talk to are incredibly concerned about the increasing violence against women. And it feels like we're constantly talking about the same issue every year after year and having the same solutions thrown at us. And there's been a lot of criticisms of the budget last night not doing enough to protect women and especially those leaving violence. And we spoke to Amanda Greavy who's a general manager at Lou's Place, which is a crisis centre in Sydney. And she said to us that something that concerned her was that Prime Minister Albanese said that he wants a royal commission, but that will take a long time. And we already know what needs to be done. And we already have strategies that aren't working. What should the Labor government be doing to help, and what would you do differently?
Well, frontline services for women who are fleeing family and domestic violence are absolutely critical. Like that's where you go. You need safety straight away. There needs to be a place for women to go. At the moment, those services are just turning women away, right? Because they're not getting the funding to provide the services that are needed. And the budget contained no new funding for these frontline services. And they've been crystal clear about what they need. They essentially need $5 billion over the next few years in order to fund it because they're just massively underfunded at the moment, especially after the last 10 years of the last government. Like they're just massively underfunded. And so the government needs to provide, at a bare minimum, needs to provide the services, the money that these frontline services need to be able to deal with the women who are coming in and seeking help. And one of the things that Labor did was extend a Morrison-era scheme of payments of $5,000. Because the first thing to note is that that's A, it's not a new scheme, it's a scheme that was there from Scott Morrison, but B, most of the chunk of the money doesn't actually go to the women. The chunk of it goes across to support services. But C, if you're giving women money at a time they need it to reach out to these services, then those services have got to be there. Otherwise, you're basically saying, we will help you, but there will be nowhere for you to go. And it's that, there's lots of things that need to be done, lots and lots of things that need to be done. But one of the things the government can do is fund the services, and Labor's not doing it.
And I'm curious to know, how has your opinion on Labor's position on Israel and Gaza evolved over the last few months or even years?
Well, Labor has continued to back the invasion of Gaza. And when they brought a motion to Parliament after the events of October 7, which everyone said, that we condemned it and said that shouldn't happen. But it became clear that there was an invasion looming of Gaza. And in Gaza, you've got 2.2 million people walled into an area half the size of Canberra. 40% of them are under 15, right? It's basically a walled-in primary school, and it became clear that the Israeli military was going to launch a massive assault on them. And Labor brought a motion to Parliament to say we back it, right? We back it. And we voted against that. The Greens voted against it, and we're the only ones in Parliament to vote against it because we said that that will just unleash a humanitarian catastrophe, right? And tragically, we've seen over 34,000 people killed. We've seen famine. We've seen a health system just utterly collapsed. With that, they all got herded into the south, down to Rafah, and now, as you know, as we sit here talking now, the Israeli military is saying they're going to continue bombing Rafah, where people have got nowhere to go. We need a permanent ceasefire, an immediate and permanent ceasefire, so that there can then be a process of ending the occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory, so that there can be a just and lasting peace for Palestinians and Israelis based on their rights to self-determination under international law. But Labor keeps backing the invasion, and they wring their hands and they say, oh, well, we don't support this latest incursion, and then they do nothing about it. And what's worse is that there's two-way weapons and ex-military trade going on between Australia and the Israeli government, military and corporations. Like there is actually weapons parts being manufactured here in Australia are finding their way over there for use by the Israeli military. So it's not, so they continue to back the invasion and they continue the military trade. And we're saying really, really clearly, Labor should join those other countries around the world that are calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. And Labor continues to give its full backing in words and in actions to the invasion of Gaza, and that's something, and I think that is out of step with what the majority of people in this country want. The majority of people in this country want peace, want a permanent ceasefire, and that's what we're going to keep fighting for and try and get the government to change its mind.
Albanese recently made a statement saying that to those in the Gaza encampments couldn't find Jordan on the map. I suppose, what do you make of those comments, and I suppose the belittling of the students who are making encampments to support Palestine?
Well, Anthony Albanese and Labor love to call anyone who thinks different to them juvenile and belittle them. And they say it is juvenile to want, Labor thinks it is apparently juvenile to want a world where everyone can afford to put a roof over their head and the government builds public housing, or that it's somehow immature to want to call for an end to the invasion and call for a just and lasting peace that's based on an end to the occupation and Palestinians and Israelis both having the right to live in security. I mean, I visited the Melbourne University encampment. It was incredibly peaceful, incredibly thoughtful. You know, people were working hard to make sure no one missed their assignments and that everyone was covered for what they do. People were looking after each other's needs. There were education sessions being run. It was one of the most thoughtful, peaceful events that I've been to for a very long time. I would say to Anthony Albanese, he should back the university encampments. Right, this is students doing what students have done for generations, which is protest peacefully, fight to make the world a better place. There was a better standard of debate amongst the students that I was speaking to at the university encampments than there is in the parliamentary chamber, and I include Anthony Albanese in that. I think those kind of statements that try and belittle people are part of the reason that people are turning off politics. And I guess one of the messages that I want to say is actually there's a different way.